Tom, thank you. Thank you for that very, very generous introduction, and particularly for the work that the Religious Freedom Institute does, together with the work that we see the Center for Ethics and Culture doing, and most particularly for what we see is happening thanks to the work at Notre Dame. And to you, Dan, a special word of appreciation for the extraordinary role you've played in bringing all this together. Before beginning these remarks, I want to express my appreciation to Thomas Farr, to the president of the Religious Freedom Institute, for his gracious invitation to be here, to be a part, to join all of you in this very, very important symposium. The title, What is to be Done About Global Persecution of Christians, highlights both the fact that persecution of Christians is ongoing, and that we who stand with our persecuted brothers and sisters must continue to find ways of helping to bring an end to what has become a living nightmare of ongoing martyrdom for far too long. And add to this the continuous persecution of Christians, add to this the failure of the West, the Western world, to recognize, let alone respond to it. And we begin to get some idea of the dimension of this tragedy. Not long ago, a local daily ran the front page story and headline questioning, quote, why the West is blind to Christian persecution. That and like questions brings us to this symposium. I also recognize and want to call attention to the importance of the 3-year study Under Caesar's Sword in response to persecution, supervised by leaders of the Center for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame and the Religious Freedom Institute here in Washington. And the documentary film that was just referenced and that you'll have a chance to see very, very shortly. In describing the strategies of survival, association, and confrontation, I join with you in expressing the hope that this important report will begin to have some lasting and much needed awareness raising to help spur people on to some action, people and institutions. The persecution of Christians is indeed a phenomenon that we see worldwide. Reports suggest that about 200 million Christians around the globe are in risk of physical violence, arrest, torture, even death, simply because they live and practice a faith that is not acceptable to the rulers in that part of the world. The journalist John Allen recently estimated that, and this is a quote, the number of Christians killed for religious reasons is roughly 1 every hour, 365 days a year. That's from a Crooks article in 2016, just December. Other Christians face varying degrees of oppression and restriction on the full practice of their faith. The place where persecution of Christians is being most severely experienced is the very place where Christianity all began, in that region of the world that is the birthplace of the Christian faith. So here is where I would like to focus this morning. I've been asked in the time allotted me at the opening of this symposium to address the topic of the persecution of Christians, but more specifically the question raised by this whole symposium, and which really seeks a response. How do Christians respond to this extraordinary reality manifested today? How can the rest of the world exercise solidarity with those being persecuted? It seems to me that our response includes four interrelated elements. The first, we must be aware of what's happening. We must be aware of what's happening to Christians around the world. And part of the benefit that we derive from a meeting like this is simply the raising of awareness of this tragedy, but particularly in the Middle East. The second is that we must raise our voices to amplify the muffled cries of those who are suffering such outrageous persecution. Dare I say that the volume of our voices must make it difficult for others to ignore this situation, to make it difficult for others to ignore the pleas of help from those being persecuted. We must speak out to rouse the slumbering consciences of too much of our culture and stir them into some realization they have an obligation to respond. The third of the 4 points, we must continue to support the flow of material assistance through whatever institution we choose in order to help those beleaguered sisters and brothers who are forced to live in deplorable situations. And finally, in the fourth point, we must, of course, continue to pray. To pray for them, those that are suffering, but also to pray for a change of heart for all of those who are either involved in these atrocities or who are simply ignoring them. Being a Catholic priest, I, of course, personally begin with prayer, turning to God, who we believe in faith is with us even in our sufferings. I'm also confident that the first response of our Christian sisters and brothers facing persecution is to pray. It's all they have left. Their faith and the possibility of lifting their voices in prayer. As Pope Francis has noted in the past, and again in a video message last month, to accompany his own prayer intention for persecuted Christians, he said, "They are persecuted and killed because they are Christians." He said it makes no difference whether they are Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox. They're Christians. And they respond to persecution precisely by being a Christian. My brothers and sisters, they might avoid the violence if they simply gave up the demands made on them to give up Christ. If they gave in to those demands, or as that demand takes a form in different parts of the world, to a secularism that is really just another form of hostility to faith people. Prayer is essentially the way in which we who have nothing else to offer fall back on as our last and surest support. My first point, though, is our obligation. We have to remain informed about what's happening. It's not really our prerogative to choose to get into all kind of other issues and ignore this. Last week, Christians around the world observed Holy Week, during which we, in a special way, remembered the suffering and the death of Jesus Christ. A traditional practice during this time of prayer, is what we call the way of the cross, which recalls Jesus carrying the cross on the way to his crucifixion. Today, in a very real sense, Christians in the Holy Land are experiencing their own personal way of the cross, and they're looking for those of us who would be willing to step forward like Simon of Cyrene and help them carry that cross. Across the Middle East, and particularly in countries like Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Christian women and men and children have been and are being persecuted. They're being persecuted with violence, legal restrictions, social hostility. It's no wonder that because of the violence, because of the persecution, because of the tensions and official policies which deprive them of their fundamental rights, many have fled to other countries. Imagine what it would be like if we had to pick up tomorrow and simply move from home. If we had to take what we could, put it in a handbag, and leave, not knowing whether you were ever going to be able to go back home. Going all the way back to antiquity, not many decades after Jesus, with Joseph and Mary, fled to Egypt, Egypt has been a home of many, many religious traditions, many faith traditions, including a sizable Christian population, Coptic Christian, with an ancient heritage. All found a way until recently to live together. The last several years, however, that tranquility that Christians once experienced has been totally disrupted. Since the rise of the extremist organization ISIS, also known as ISIL or Daesh, the Islamic Caliphate, things have just continued to get worse. Last year, ISIS was officially cited by the United States Department of State as a perpetrator of genocide. And yet, I would venture to say that most people in this country, dependent on media, would not know that. Most of our brothers and sisters, fellow citizens across this land, would probably be unaware of that. Annual reports from the United States Commission on Interreligious Freedom tell us of the atrocities committed by ISIS, such as summary executions, systematic kidnappings, rape and other sexual assaults, sexual enslavement and human trafficking, bombing, destruction of houses of worship, and forced conversions, all of this part of a genocidal effort. And how much of that do we really know about? When an infant washes up on a shore and becomes the attention for one day on the front page of major newspapers, all of a sudden there's a flash of consciousness, and then we never hear about it again. The civil war in Syria, which has included war crimes such as the use of chemical weapons, among other horrors, has added to suffering imposed on these innocent people who did not bring this conflict into being. Millions of people all over in Syria have been displaced, and they're the ones in dire need of some humanitarian assistance. More than a year ago, the United States officially acknowledged that ISIS is perpetrating genocide against Christians and other religious groups with an aim to eradicating them from the Middle East. Despite some degradation of ISIS forces due to military strikes against their strongholds, life has not gotten any better for the Christians in Iraq or Syria. They were able to celebrate this past Christmas at Aleppo in the pictures that we saw in a bombed-out church. One of the beautiful and powerful images was the priest in this rubble, brushing off what was left of an altar and saying to that small congregation gathered there, "We must never, never hate. We're here to celebrate our Lord, and we must do so as people who love." The violence against Christians has also increased in recent years in parts of Egypt, where Islam is the state religion since 2014, the new constitution. And there is that constant threat to Christians, Coptic Christians, Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians. Our Holy Father is going to visit there at the end of next week. And the whole idea is simply to be able to stand with other Christian, Muslim, and Jewish leaders and say, we're all here together. As part of their strategy of terror and intimidation, ISIS has released a video just recently calling on its militants and sympathizers to, during this visit, massacre the kuffar, that is, the infidel Christians. It is also important for us to note that that word, infidel, is so often misused. It has become a word dripping with venom when hurled against Christians in various parts of the world by extremist groups. And this gathering in Egypt will be primarily to indicate that we have to keep and be very conscious of extremists distinct from the great body who are people like ourselves trying simply to live together. While the state of affairs may appear dark, Pope Francis urges us to be resolute. He says we must not resign ourselves to thinking of a Middle East without Christians. For 2,000 years, Christians have confessed their faith in Jesus there in the Holy Land. We need to be with them. We need to stand with them. In fact, it is precisely because many of the Christians there have not resigned themselves to this fate that they have to remain silent in their homes or in the areas where they live, that they're seeking some support from all of us. We don't have to leave, a woman was quoted. It's our country. These are our churches. We won't leave our home. We won't leave our churches, said one woman who no doubt represents countless others. This, she said, is the place of our birth. Why would I have to leave it? That brings us to the second point. Pope Francis warns of a growing problem which we as Americans, as Christians, as a civilized people, need to confront. A selfish attitude of indifference to one another and to God that has taken on global proportions. A simple ability to look the other way when others are suffering. The persecution of Christians has been called one of the transcendent human rights challenges of our time. Closely connected to the trend to be aware of what is happening is our second point, the need to raise our voices, to provide that voice of conscience, to make it difficult for others to ignore the situation. This is not a Christian crisis of concern only to Christians. It's a human crisis that we all need to address. Pope Francis has sought to raise international awareness of this growing crisis of suffering. It was a major concern, too, of Pope Benedict XVI in his apostolic exhortation on the Church in the Middle East. Pope Francis has written to the General Secretary of the United Nations, appealing to the international community to stir itself, to find ways to protect innocent lives. Next week, as I mentioned, he'll be there in Egypt at the invitation of the government, of Christian and of Muslim leaders. And while there, he'll speak at a peace conference and engage in interreligious dialogue and pray for the victims of religious violence. Here in Washington, ecumenical summits of scholars already referred to, dignitaries, religious leaders from the Middle East, and groups like the Holy Land Christian Ecumenical Foundation have met multiple times to discuss, to try to lift up in public sight what's happening. To address the present crisis, the Organization in Defense of Christians has been also actively involved. Such efforts are only one way to speak out. This conference is a superlative manner of speaking out in the hope that with the quality of institution represented here and the importance of all of you participating in this, there might be a collective voice loud enough to be heard even over the indolence of disinterest. This crucial work of educating people about the genocidal violence and horrors perpetrated against Christians in the Middle East and elsewhere is a task we cannot do alone. So we must call on others to join us, to see and to report on what's happening. While media has not been particularly helpful, there are some efforts to tell the story. For example, there was the 60-minute feature on the oppression faced by the Coptic Christians in Egypt, which has only gotten worse since then. This story was a start, but there's a need for continuous commitment to tell the narrative of ongoing killing and destruction. Think of it. The Holocaust horror might have long been tragically forgotten if it had not been for the commitment of media and the film industry to keep alive the memory of that horror and to keep alive that memory for future generations. We need the same level of commitment and talent to make present in the consciousness of today the slaughter of Christians and other minorities that are the object of genocide. What has become a more disturbing question, not without cause, asks if the silence of so much of officialdom around the world is being interpreted as a subtle form of political acceptance. Some in this country today have justified not doing much of anything because they say the violence does not affect immediately United States national interests. They would leave suffering people to fend for themselves. In responding to such misplaced sentiments, I'd like to share with you just one example. The inspiring words of a young American aid worker, Carla Mueller, who was held in captivity and viciously assaulted by ISIS for 18 months before she was killed. She had been told to leave Syria because, quote, it was not her fight. Her response was, "You're right, it's not my war." But any time the world is not responding to such things because it is not their concern, it becomes my concern. One very brave, intrepid, heroic young woman saying what the world should be saying. Then she added, there should be no my people and your people. That mentality shouldn't exist. Then she went on to say there should be no greater value placed on anyone's life for any reason over and above another life. To be indifferent to the sufferings of others and the evil around us is to act in a way unworthy of our humanity. All that attitude accomplishes is an expansion of the reign of terror and the amount of blood spilled. Once we are aware of atrocities, now accurately, finally described as genocide, we need to stand and raise our voices. Our intention today is both to do that and to invite media and governments to do the same. Your voices for justice, human dignity, and freedom are too important to be kept silent. These long-suffering Christian people enduring persecution need us and all those who call themselves civilized to stand up with them. A number of years ago, I was invited to the blessing of a new building here in town. The program called for the colors to be brought in. And there was going to be the presentation of the colors, the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner, and then an invocation. And I had been invited to do this invocation, and the way this was set up, there was a curtain, and I was to stay behind the curtain because the focus would be on the flag for the singing of the national anthem, and then to step out to do the prayer. And behind me, behind the curtain, but in front of me, was the young man with a console and all these wires. He was controlling the lighting, the voice, the sound mechanism, the parting of the curtain, and he was reading from his script when he was to do all of this. And after he had thrown the light switch and the light went on the flag and he had pushed the lever and the Star-Spangled Banner began, this young man with this console on his lap and all these wires and this script struggled to stand. He struggled to get up. Why? They're playing the national anthem. Some things are worth standing for. My brothers and sisters, there are some things worth standing for. And I would suggest to you today that calling attention to the travail and making an effort to bring an end to this modern-day slaughter, this slaughter of the innocents, is something we should stand for. It's something worth getting up for, standing for. Knowing what we know, no one can say that it is not our problem, either personally or institutionally or nationally. We, all of us, have a solemn duty to defend the helpless and preserve this life, this faith, this culture, this community, this Christian world that lives under persecution. We can also ask our neighbors, co-workers, and others we know to raise their voice. That's the way we multiply our voice. To raise our voice with political leaders, with those who strive to form public opinion, and with media. To send an email or a letter, to make a phone call or urge others to do the same is one way everyone can raise their voice and multiply their voice so that it's heard. The third and more tangible element that I want to touch on is the response that brings an array of relief services that to those who need our support. Out of all of our efforts, and out of all of our comfort and our well-being and our abundance, we should be able to find a way to aid and bring support to those whose lives have been reduced by such devastation to living in tents, in huts, in primitive conditions, and now dependent on the kindness of others. We should help them too in a way that does not deprive them of the hope to return home. Neither long-term accommodation in a refugee facility, no matter how comfortable, nor resettlement in another country is the final answer to those Christians who have been forced to leave their homeland simply because they want to practice and live their faith. There are a host of agencies responding and trying to help. The agencies helping the suffering in the Middle East that I'm most familiar with include Catholic ones. That should be no surprise. Such as Catholic Relief Services, established here in the United States and providing assistance in 130 to 130 million people annually. The worldwide Caritas Internationalis, that network of which CRS is a part. The International Papal Charity, Aid to the Church in Need, and the efforts of the Knights of Columbus. But there are a host of other humanitarian efforts, many of them with ties to religious communities. These include Christian Aid, World Relief, Open Doors, Remember the Persecuted, Voice of the Martyrs, Samaritan's Purse, and many others. My brothers and sisters, this is a practical way in which people of any faith tradition and any background can be of immediate support to people who are suffering immensely. While the power of government and the international community and the resources that they can bring to bear far exceeds those of these non-governmental agencies and of churches and other religious groups, it is precisely these latter entities that are the better prepared and able to provide immediate support, since many of them have already been on the ground for years and have the faith and confidence and trust of the people they're trying to care for. Moreover, in the case of Iraq and Syria, the funding provided by the United Nations and the United States Agency for International Development and like government sources is aimed at massive refugee camps. And they have refused to provide this aid through local religious communities. Because most Christians will not go to these camps because they fear the camps themselves have been hijacked by radicals. It's reported that almost none of the publicly funded assistance actually reaches Christians. That's a Crooks report of January of this year. But there's still something more that we, as a people of faith, can do. Just as essential as providing awareness and humanitarian assistance, and that is, we can pray. I began these remarks by highlighting that, and I want to conclude with those reflections. While carrying the cross is a part of Christian life and witness, a reality that we cannot completely ignore, there is the role of Simon of Cyrene. There is the role of stepping forward with our compassion, our love, our care, and our prayer to be with people who are carrying a horrendous cross. We can join in prayer as a sign of our own commitment with our Christian brothers and sisters. We pray for all people in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, anywhere who suffer so cruelly simply because of their faith. But we also pray that people's hearts be touched in these troubled lands and throughout the world, so that toleration, religious freedom, become once more acceptable manifestations of a civilized world. My brothers and sisters, an important aspect of prayer is also to ask God's grace that we not be changed, that our hearts not be changed by the violence that's perpetrated so regularly against our brothers and sisters. Even though we see them enveloped in so much hate, we must never give in to the temptation to respond in kind. That would be the greatest victory for those who are persecuting Christians out of hatred today, to see that we have lost our identity, who we are. The great victory of those persecuting Christians would be to have us become hardened and lose the heart of who we are. We're a people who believe in the Lord Jesus, we believe in his resurrection, and we believe in the love he has introduced into this world. What better time for a conference like this than as the Christian world, and this year it was both Catholic and Orthodox, celebrating Easter at the same time, also the same week as Jewish Passover. What a wonderful, wonderful time for us to be talking about how do we respond to our brothers and sisters in need? How do we reach out to our brothers and sisters who are persecuted? How do we become a part with them in human solidarity? What better time than when the whole Christian world says, Christ triumphs over death. Christ triumphs over persecution. Christ triumphs over all hatred. It may not always be immediate, but the resurrection is the basis for why we are Christian in the first place. And it's because of that enduring realization, love one another as I have loved you, that we find an obligation to stand with our brothers and sisters, but to stand with them precisely as believers, And so our response can never be anything less than who we are, or the victory will have gone to them who persecute us. And the other thing we must remember is, whenever you do this to the least of my brothers, Jesus said, you do it to me. We stand with our brothers and sisters, because in doing that, we stand with the risen Lord. In concluding my remarks, dear friends, I would like simply to attest that what we do here today, what you have organized, is a credible, real, workable response to the question, how is it that atrocities continue in our day, and what do we do about them? They happen because there are people who are willing to commit them, and they happen because there are others who are silent in the face of them. The Religious Freedom Institute, the Center for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame, aid to the church in need, and all those who work in solidarity with them are a big part of seeing that in the face of atrocities, there are those who raise their voices, who refuse to be silent, and who recognize the importance of speaking out in defense of Christians and for religious freedom everywhere. My brothers and sisters, we must always be prepared to recognize some things are worth standing up for. And the freedom, the religious freedom, the persecuted brothers and sisters around the world are worth standing for. Thank you.